Welcome to the Creation Gospel and the series, The Spirit-Filled Family. We are continuing the series today with a segment of Spirit-Filled Singles. And in the last couple of programs, I think we laid a lot of basic groundwork for the Spirit-Filled Single. One of the problems we acknowledge with a Spirit-Filled Single is they're single for a variety of reasons. It may be that they're young and they haven't found a spouse yet, and so they're still in that preparation stage. They might be a widow or a widower. We looked specifically at the example of Hannah in reference to the widow, and some pretty astounding prophecies that she was able to point to in the Torah portion, V'zot HaBracha, and you could also be a divorced person. You know, there's any number of categories you could fall into, and even within those categories, the age range might be huge. You might be a spirit-filled single 18-year-old, or like Hannah, you might be a spirit-filled single 84-year-old. But regardless, I think the principles that we looked at in the last two programs, I think they transcend whether you're single or not, because what we emphasized was Paul's yoke. We went ahead and used Paul's example of being yoked together with an unbeliever, but we also looked at what it means to be yoked with a believer, whether that other person is a spouse, or in the case of a single, whether that yoke is going to be shared with a mentor, a counselor, some sort of spiritual authority or spiritual voice in your life, somebody who can point out the things that are less apparent, because we tend to focus more sometimes on the physical realm, the natural realm, and we need that voice of the Holy Spirit to help us balance our views so that we can pair up the physical and the spiritual. And then we saw that example there with Shimon and Hannah in the temple as the two witnesses to the anointed Messiah Yeshua. And that yoke, that proclamation, that validation through the mouths of two prophets, a prophet and a prophetess. And so the male and the female example there, it gives you the idea of being balanced, having that counterbalance, someone who is of like kind and like mind, but who is not identical. And again, these are fundamental things that apply to everyone, not just a single. In fact, that yoke, we're going to look in more depth in this program, and possibly the next, at one chapter that Paul writes, although we could probably take several more chapters that Paul wrote concerning marriage and relationships. But I want to take this program specifically to address 1 Corinthians chapter 7. 1 Corinthians chapter 7. And what I would like for you to do, if you can, if you were able to pause the video at this point, or if you're listening on audio, if you're able to pause the audio at this point, I think that would be wise to do so, because I want you to get the full context of 1 Corinthians chapter 7, because one of the verses is sometimes pulled out of this chapter, and it's confusing, because it looks like Paul is teaching against believers marrying. And if he were doing that, then we know that he's anti-Torah. He is lawless, because it's very clear one of the first commandments that is given to mankind is to be fruitful and multiply. That marriage is very much a part of the expectation of the Torah. And so if Paul is prohibiting marriage or discouraging people from marrying, then he is not a valid Torah teacher. But, and I think this is the case, if we are taking his words not just out of the context of that chapter, but if we were also ripping his words out of the historical context and out of the religious context. See, we cannot ignore these three things. When you study biblical hermeneutics, which is methods of deriving meaning and significance from a biblical text, you will find that in the rules of hermeneutics, number one, you need a rule of complete mention. You need to see this issue or word or phrase or whatever it might be in the context of the entire scripture. You can't simply lift a verse out and devise a meaning based on this one example. It has to fit into the entire thematic context of that issue. Secondly, you cannot ignore the historical context. If you do that, then you will fundamentally misunderstand many things. If you don't know what's going on historically, then you'll invent things. And there again, that happens frequently because we rip things out of their historical context. We come to wrong conclusions. Same thing by ripping it out of its religious context. Judaism, or should we say the Judaisms of the first century, because there were many expressions of Judaism. There was Essenes, there was the school of Hillel, there was the school of Shammai. There was a pretty long list. And it did not really become homogeneous until after the destruction of the temple, when the Bat Kol, the voice, came from heaven that said the school of Hillel, their rulings would carry the authority, and everything pretty much grouped up under that one doctrinal viewpoint. But up until that time, up until that destruction of the Second Temple, there were many variations in interpretations, and to the point that sometimes the schools, there was murder over the issues. That's how intense the dynamics were between the school of Shammai and Hillel. They're both Pharisees. And that's the trouble with reading the Brit Chadashah, the New Testament. Sometimes it'll say Pharisees, but if you don't understand the historical and religious difference among the Pharisees, then it's going to cause you to put everybody in the same category. When the views between those schools were so divergent that, like I said, literally murders were committed, because the school of Shammai at one point gave some tacit encouragement to the zealots, and they committed murders. So that dynamic, even to understand that the school of Shammai said that under no circumstances could a Gentile have a portion in the world to come, but the school of Hillel said that the righteous Gentile did have a place in the world to come. And so Paul is from the school of Hillel. And for the most part, it is the opinions of Hillel that eventually carried the day. They were much more lenient. And what you'll notice, if you line up what Yeshua teaches with what came out of the school of Hillel, I would say over 90% of the time they agree. So which group of Pharisees would have had the greatest animosity toward Yeshua? Because when you see examples of the Pharisees plotting against Yeshua and so forth, it's not likely coming out of the school of Hillel because he's teaching their interpretations. Most likely it's coming out of the school of Shammai. And remember, Yeshua, sometimes it seems like he had derogatory things to say about Gentiles, but not really, if we really get down and study the words and what he's saying. Because we know that the whole problem, see, he turns over the money changer tables in the temple, which causes a huge uproar. Well, if you understand the historical and the religious context of what he's doing, then it makes sense why when he addresses it, he says, For it is written, my Father's house shall be a house of prayer for all nations. What is he doing there? He is identifying with the teaching of Hillel. He is supporting that. He is authenticating what Hillel says, that the Gentile can be brought near to the covenant. It is the school of Shammai that does not believe they have a part in the world to come and does not want to accept the sacrifices of the Gentiles. And so what they were doing is basically taking their money or taking their sacrifices, pocketing it or distributing it as they will, but not allowing them in to have a portion in the world to come, keeping them far off from the covenant. So what Yeshua is saying, the issue I'm fighting with you about is whether the Gentile may come in. And so when it says Pharisees, you have to understand historically and religiously, what's the dynamic of that time? Who is he addressing? He's specifically addressing the school of Shammai. That's why I say pulling one verse out sometimes is a big mistake. So I said all that. I took 15 minutes to tell you to stop the tape, if you can, which I guess we're beyond the era of tape. Pause the video, if you can. Read the entire chapter of 1 Corinthians chapter 7. And then when you come back, what I'd like to do is break them down 1 or 2 verses at a time and explain for you, which is the practice of good hermeneutics as best I can, explain to you not just the biblical context of the passage, but hopefully pull in some historical and some religious context from 30 BC to 70 AD. All right, because Paul died, I believe, about 4 years before the destruction of the Second Temple. So he lived in a generational reality that sometimes we don't really understand. But he was very much a product of his generation. And, you know, the fact that he points out to people, I am a Pharisee. Well, he's giving them his position regarding the Gentiles. When he says, I am a Pharisee, it would help us for him to go on and say, of the school of Hillel. But we know he sat at the feet of Gamliel, who was from the school of Hillel. So we've got small religious and historical context clues. So where I can, where I know something about the historical context or the religious context of Paul's instructions as it pertains to both Jews and Gentiles, I will try to pull that out maybe verse by verse, and we'll go slowly. And hopefully that will help us in terms of the Spirit-filled single understand whether the Father has an opinion as to whether it's better to be single or married, if that helps. And I think you'll like the conclusion of it, whether you're single or married. If you're happy single, I think it'll make you happier. If you'd be happier married, I think it'll make you happier in terms of validating that search for your spouse. But that's what we want to do. So if you'll stop, read, when you come back, what we're going to do is start looking, like I said, practicing good hermeneutics at some of the context to hopefully deconstruct some of these things here. And so we're going to go topically against the foundations of the Torah, historical, cultural reality in which this letter was written to the Corinthians. So if you've done that reading, if you've read the chapter and you're coming back, historically, if we look at this letter written to the Corinthians, we know that Corinth was full of paganism and idolatry, immorality of every kind. It was full of a lot of sorcery, black arts, and so forth. And although I'm sure believing Jews did attend this fellowship, I believe if we'll check the sources, we're going to find out that it's highly likely that it was mostly populated by former pagans, possibly uncircumcised God-fearers who had not formally converted to Judaism. There would be two categories. We're not really sure how separate these two categories were at this particular year in history. Now they're very cleanly separated into the Ger Toshav, which is the stranger who is living within the community. It talks about the stranger within your gates. It's somebody who wants to live in Israel, and that Ger has to agree to abide by the rules of Israel if he's going to sojourn there. That's the Ger Toshav. Now, the Ger Tzedek, the righteous Gentile, is one who is in the process of a formal conversion. Now, the formality of a conversion was much less formal in the first century than it is today. Today, it's very structured. And so, like you see in Acts chapter 2, you see proselytes. So these would have been the Ger coming from all these different countries, and they would have possibly been in different stages. But most likely, they are proselytes who are either undergoing instruction for the sake of becoming Jewish, or they're recently Jewish. The Ger Tzedek, or one who has gone through Gerut, is one who has converted. And so they could be at any stage in the learning process up to and beyond circumcision, and actually formally being accepted into the community. But in terms of Corinth, you're going to have people in different stages of coming out of idolatry. And this letter is written at a precarious time in history. The persecution of believers, of which Paul was actually a part, if we remember his history, he was actually persecuting believers, misunderstanding, I believe, the mission of Yeshua, seeing these believers as a threat, and maybe misunderstanding that because Yeshua was not so overt in transmitting the message of salvation to the Gentiles, not really understanding that he already believed in much of what Yeshua was teaching. Because like we said, Yeshua's teaching is in very close alignment to the school of Hillel, which is where Paul learned. And so Paul took part in the persecution of believers, and this persecution continued. Just because Paul quit didn't mean that everybody quit. Not just within the Jewish community itself, but from outside. Anybody who's different, or as we could see in the case of Paul, anybody who is infringing upon the sale of gods and goddesses, anybody that messes with your economic picture is going to come under persecution. But in general, it wasn't just the Jewish believers coming under persecution, or non-Jewish believers. It was persecution of Jews in general. So you talk about chaos. At the same time, zealots, which Judas could have been within that group of zealots. There's some play on words with his name, Judas Iscariot. And so it could mean that he was from that group of zealots, but it's also another way of saying strangled. So since the scriptures are written later in history, it may have been by calling him Judas Iscariot, they're actually identifying his death, his mode of death by strangulation. Regardless, the zealots were drawing down the wrath of Rome. They were drawing down the wrath of the local puppet rulers, not just the Jewish leaders at the time. So when Paul dies around 66 AD, the destruction of the temple is only 4 years away. And by then, you can tell from the writings of that time, the Jews kind of knew, they could see the writing on the wall. The temple was going to be destroyed. It was just a matter of how soon. Just like, look how long the first temple had that sword basically over them. It was just a matter of time, and the prophets were telling, it's a matter of time. Jerusalem will fall. This is the same kind of historical period. Everybody knows that the temple's about to fall. The exact date and how bad the fall, people don't know that. But they know that there's military judgment coming. They know that there's economic judgment coming. They know that there's religious chaos coming. And Paul, into this chaos, is attempting to write some wise instruction to the believing communities. But you can tell from his writing, because sometimes it seems like he changes his mind about things. Not really. He's writing to different communities with different questions and different problems. Our problem is we don't have the question. And so we're reading the answer. We're not really sure what the question was. We're having to guess. But we can see he addresses different issues within different communities. And the only thing all these communities really have in common is their belief that Yeshua is the Messiah. And that they're all living in the chaos of the age. And so when you think that 4 years later, after Paul dies, the temple's destroyed, imagine something that has stood not just all of your generation, as far back as you can remember, but generations upon generations back. This symbol of faith has stood. And so Paul is addressing a group of people who are beginning to fall really into utter despair at the destruction of the temple. And, no matter how strong your belief is in the restoration of all things, they are facing the destruction of that physical edifice, that reminder of their faith. It talks about how the disciples admired the stones of the temple, and Yeshua's like, that's not going to last forever, folks. You're gonna become little temples. But if the temple is all you have ever known, imagine if it's wiped out and the despair you would feel. You could no longer bring your Passover sacrifice. You could no longer have that priest interceding for you on Yom Kippur. You could no longer have the water pouring ceremony at Sukkot. All these symbols that commemorate moments in time between the covenant people and their covenant Elohim, they're going to be wiped out. And so they're already grieving, even though it's not yet fallen. They're already beginning that process of grief. You know when things are going to fall. And so if we want to understand the grief and the doubt and the fear of the people to whom Paul is writing in his letter to the Corinthians, there's other sources we can go to and actually get a different perspective on how people were thinking at the time, knowing that the temple is about to be destroyed. Now, one of the better sources is the Mishnah, the Code of Jewish Law. That Mishnah, we're not talking about the Talmud because it's going to have Gemara, it's going to have these glosses and so forth. It's going to develop into more than just the Mishnah. But if we go to the Mishnah, and again, some of the later comments and the Talmud concerning the destruction of the temple and how families are to deal with that loss, then we get some insight into the mindset of not just Paul, but the people he's writing to, because they're undergoing the same fears. They're undergoing the same apprehension, whether they are Jews, unbelieving Jews, or whether they are believing Jews, or whether they are righteous Gentiles who have been brought near to the covenant through Yeshua. Now, if we look at the Talmud, Bava Batra 60b, and remember the basis of the Talmud is the Mishnah. That's the essence of it. And then at its very middle, it's addressing the actual scripture. All right, so it's commentary on the scripture. How it's going to be applied. In Bava Batra 60b, it says, the sages who witnessed the destruction of the temple wrote the following. And see if what they wrote doesn't sound almost verbatim what Paul is telling the Corinthians. It says, by right, we should issue a decree that Jews should not marry and have children, so that the seed of Abraham will come to an end of its own accord. Now, I quoted you a very small section of that, but that's, again, we're applying hermeneutics. We want to look at what was going on historically and religiously. Now, in the appendix of Workbook 3, there will be a more complete treatment of that one statement in a bigger context, so it makes more sense. But what I really wanted you to draw from that is the Jews had the same despair that we're hearing out of Paul as he addresses the Corinthians. The point here is to capture the moment. It's like taking a photograph of the moment of the grief over the coming destruction of the temple and the coming destruction of the city that Paul is having as he's writing. Because, see, that temple and that city had stood in some degree of holy function since the return from Babylon. That's a long time. That's generation after generation that have been able to worship at the temple. And it is imminent. Its destruction is imminent. And into this, the Jewish sages are saying, you know what, we should just tell Jews, quit marrying and having children, because bad things are coming. When we come back, we'll match this against what Paul is writing.
Shalom, guys. This is Matthew Vanderels over at Hebraic Roots Network. Guys, we continue broadcasting these teachings of Yeshua, of Torah, to all nations by support by viewers like you. We'd ask you, if you currently do not support HRN, prayerfully consider sending us a one-time donation or maybe even a monthly donation to HRN so we can continue supporting the nations with the gospel of Yeshua. It's up to you, guys. It's up to you to keep this message going, and we thank you for that. Shalom.
Welcome back. Okay, we've heard the utter despair, the historical, the religious despair that the Jews are experiencing. Like I said, Bava Batra 60b, by right we should issue a decree that Jews should not marry and have children, so that the seed of Abraham will come to an end of its own accord. Now, again, this was because they're facing the destruction of something that has stood for hundreds of years. Now, let's just say the United States, for example. We have governmental, religious foundations that have stood less than a few hundred years. We're a fairly new country. But imagine, one of those icons that we look at as a focal point of what it means to be American. Let's say that, the Supreme Court or Congress, which may not be a bad thing, but let's suppose that this building is completely wiped out, the symbol of our democracy, a symbol of freedom. Imagine that that's been there, but now it's no longer there. That somehow we're going to have to find a different focal point that represents the ideals of democracy. But the reality is, when the temple is destroyed, Israel is dispersed. It's not a matter of simply finding a new building. They're sent into exile. And, you know, that focal point had stood for over 600 years, right? A temple. You know, now you've got a space of exile of 70 years in exile in Babylon. But that legacy of the first edifice that had stood for hundreds of years, remember, that remained in the memories of the elders. They remembered the first temple when they came back and they rebuilt. So they're carrying forward a couple of things. First of all, returning from Babylon, something was repaired, and that was the blatant idolatry of the first temple. But now the second temple is about to be destroyed for a different reason. If we look at the Jewish sources, we say that the second temple was destroyed, it says, for baseless hatred. Baseless hatred among brothers. And there again, you could see those ongoing battles between the school of Hillel, Shammai, the Essenes, all these groups vying for position, vying for power and control. And so it seems as though, I mean, if we look at the two patterns, there was only 70 years in exile for idolatry. But look how long the exile lasted for baseless hatred. See, that's the caution. When we're drawn near to the covenant, Yeshua's blood was shed for us. He died to draw us near to the covenant. But I don't know how we expect to draw near and not rectify the same mistake, baseless hatred among brothers. See, a lot of Christians are coming out of Christianity and turning, and they want to obey the Torah. They understand that it's Adonai's teaching instruction for life. And so they want to shed all vestiges of idolatry and paganism in their worship practices. But then they come to the second temple and they repeat the same mistakes as when the second temple stood, which is constant infighting. There's no way we inherit a third temple if we've only come out of idolatry, but we haven't come out of baseless hatred and a desire to separate brothers. The third temple is not a place where I think we can exist, but that sort of thinking. So the punishment was much more severe for baseless hatred. Now, we know that Yeshua had already prepared his disciples, and the apostles were starting to prepare people for a day when they would become those little temples, taking the Torah to the four corners of the earth. And in fact, in the Jewish literature, that's exactly what it says the Jewish exile was for. It is to gather Israel from the four corners of the earth. But regardless, even though Yeshua had prepared his inner circle for his death prior to the actual day, they nevertheless sunk to the depths of fear and despair when that day finally arrived. And so just carry that over to the second temple. It doesn't matter if you know the writings on the wall. The day the temple falls, you're still going to be in that grief and despair. And so Paul is preparing the believing communities for the destruction of the temple. Now, that doesn't mean it won't hurt when they receive the news of the actual day. Because if you remember, the gospel began to go forth from the holy city because believers and the apostles, the Jewish believing community, had laid down their worldly goods for common use so that the gospel could go forth. And so the Gentiles out there who had received Yeshua, they have been the beneficiaries of this selfless devotion to the Word. And now what they're finding out is those who sacrifice so much for us from Jerusalem, that community is destroyed. So the good news is that there was a precedent in Scripture that could give the Corinthians hope. In spite of the impending invasion of the Babylonian army, when the first temple stood, in spite of the reality that the city and the first temple were about to be destroyed, Jeremiah receives a prophetic word in all the mire of his prison. He has a cousin, Hanamel. And Hanamel sends word, in fact, he confirms the word, that all is not going to be lost. There will be a restoration. So his cousin says, buy my field. Buy my field. Now Jeremiah really isn't in a position to buy a field. I mean, he's in and out of favor pretty fast. But in the midst of this siege, Jeremiah agrees to buy the field, signs the contract, and buries the deed in an earthenware jar, which is, we know, is a symbol of the human body. So although he's buried in despair, it'll be resurrected. For once again, we know that the Jewish people returned to the land and they rebuilt the city and the temple. And we read that, but, Rabbi Cardozo pointed this out in one of his books, that if we step into Jeremiah's sandals, that's how we realize how utterly astonishing it was, how audacious it was for Hanamel to offer the field to Jeremiah. He says it's astonishing that under the terrible circumstances in which the Jews lived at that moment, one simple Jew had the nerve to walk up to the very prophet who persistently predicted that utter disaster was imminent and dared to offer to sell him a piece of land. No doubt this piece of land was full of corpses and located in a war zone that prevented the new buyer from visiting his property. Who would think of trying to sell, let alone buy, in such a market? And when you think about it, Paul is doing the same thing. In the midst of all the despair, all the military and economic oppression that believers are living under, the religious pressure that believers are living under, out of all this chaos, Paul is writing to the Corinthians concerning the advantages and disadvantages of remaining single or marrying. I mean, that's as audacious as buy this field. Where we're going to be 4 years from now, that's the big worry. But by addressing the issue of marriage, he's helping them work through these fears. He's trying to find that basis in the Torah and stay grounded in the Torah, nevertheless saying this is one of those generations where it's going to be very difficult. And so, like Jeremiah, you can sense the heaviness, the sorrow that he has for the impending fall of the temple. But like Jeremiah, he concedes that hope must remain for return. And only if people marry and bear children will there be anybody to return and rebuild whenever that return may be. Like it says in Jeremiah 32:15, thus says the Lord of hosts, the God of Israel, houses, fields, and vineyards shall again be bought in this land. In the meantime, there's going to be a scattering, there's going to be a diaspora, there's going to be an exile. And so Paul is speaking to these spirit-filled married couples, sons, daughters, widows, widowers, divorcees, singles, and he's trying to speak consistently with the commandments of the Torah without ignoring the perilous time in which they are living and dying. So what I wanted to do at this point is let's go verse by verse and analyze what Paul is saying and the traditions or the Torah text that he might be drawing from and trying to speak encouragement into the political, the economic, the religious, the military realities of his generation. And if we need to, maybe we might look at the Greek text, which is, again, that's something you can do on your own if you have a Strong's Concordance, something I would encourage you to do when you have questions about how a word is being used. But let's just try to get some plain, common sense, historical, religious background to go along with the Torah and what Paul is writing. So let's start with verse number 1. He says, now concerning the things about which you wrote, it is good for a man not to touch a woman. All right, we'll stop there. For a man to touch a woman frequently means to know her sexually in Scripture. The Bible is very cognizant of indecency, and a lot of times it will use euphemisms to describe less honorable things, or even honorable things that are not for public view. And so the sexual relationship sometimes is referred to as touching a woman. Now in practice, the practice of Jews, there is a principle known as negiah. And with negiah, which there again, naga, touching, a man does not have physical contact with women other than close relatives, and women do not touch men other than close male relatives. That's a principle of negiah, with the understanding that touching, and as Americans, sometimes we're very touchy-feely people. We'll put our hand on someone's forearm, when we're talking to them, or we might put a hand on their shoulder as reassurance, even if it's not a close family member. But within Judaism, if this is not a close family member of the opposite sex, then you have no business touching that person, with the idea that casual touching can lead to more intimate touching. So what Paul is saying is that it would be ridiculous to say it's never good for a man to have relations with a woman. That would be a transgression of Exodus 24:10 and the original commandment to be fruitful and multiply. The difference there being, Exodus 24:10, as we talked about with the spirit-filled husband, it has to do with the onah, that period of time for conjugal relations. And there's two different contexts here as we're talking about touching a woman sexually. In Genesis, the commandment to be fruitful and multiply, that is for the purpose of reproduction. But if we look at Exodus 24:10, it is not dependent upon the desire to reproduce. It is a time of intimacy, and which one would just simply take pleasure in the other, without that ultimate view toward reproduction. And so, in terms of that, Paul is not overturning the Torah, he's actually upholding the oral law. And observing that fence that says, just in case, the casual touching, turning into gossip and so forth, accidental or whatever, how do I decide if it was accidental? Rather than have all these things that might lead to great sin, then I just don't have any business touching someone who's not my wife or a close female relative. Again, that's coming out of Jewish law, that comment there. Verse 2, it says, but because of immoralities, each man is to have his own wife, and each woman is to have her own husband. There again, the second verse seems to bear out the Jewish law, the tradition that Paul is passing on. That negiah, the Jewish law, which limits touching to one's own spouse. Because again, casual touching can lead to more intimacy, it can lead to gossip, it can lead to suspicion. Remember the jealous husband in the Torah? Rather than let it grow into that, negiah is a fence constructed to prevent a sin that could lead to death. And so we tend to look down on Jewish fences in the oral law, but if you understand at the heart of it is, I don't want you to commit a sin that would cause your death, then it makes more sense why some fences were erected, especially in the case of sexual contact with someone. You really don't have any business with excessive touching of anybody of the opposite sex if you're not related to them. In the Greek context as well, it denotes sexual relations. When it says to touch a woman, it is a euphemism specifically for sexual relations, and that idiom occurs 10 times in Greek literature of that day, and all the references except for one refer to sexual relations. And so what Paul is saying is to touch a woman means to touch your own wife, not someone else's. In other words, you have relations with your own wife, and each woman is to have her own husband. She's not to be even touching someone of the opposite sex. And again, it's coming out of Jewish law. Verse 3 says, the husband must fulfill his duty to his wife, and likewise also the wife to her husband. Again, Paul's pulling in that foundational text of Exodus 24:10, which is why we spent so much time on it, and the Spirit-filled husband. Because Exodus 24:10 defines the 3 irreducible obligations of a husband to his wife: food, covering, and conjugal time. Now, that Greek rendering, fulfill the obligation or pay the debt, that also refers specifically to the fulfillment of sexual needs within the marriage. And so the only thing really new in this verse is that Paul is imposing the obligation equally without regard to gender. If you remember in Exodus 24:10, it was the obligation of the husband to the wife. But now Paul, and that's, if you'll go back and you review the first 2 programs of Spirit-Filled Single, we talked about that equal yoke. And so Paul is giving here again another example of that yoke in marriage, where he says obligation is mutual. They're obligated to one another in terms of the touching, in terms of their sexual relationship. And what he's doing is he's really lending a sense of teamwork and a sense of cooperation to the couple, according to that Exodus 24:10 formula. He's just expanding it and really talking about being co-equal and counterbalanced within the yoke. And he continues in verse 4. He says, the wife does not have authority over her own body, but the husband does. And likewise also, the husband does not have authority over his own body, but the wife does. So, there again, sometimes it seems as though Paul is sending conflicting messages when he writes letters to different congregations. But again, Paul is writing to people who have different questions. And so, in other contexts, Paul is dealing really with a different problem. Because in another context, he talks about the authority of the husband over the wife. But then in this text, to the Corinthians, he makes submission to the other's authority within the marriage mutual. Again, he's reinforcing his team theme. That team interpretation of Exodus 24:10, which is the foundation of all Jewish marriage law, really. If you look at Exodus 24:10, it doesn't seem that such a small verse should carry such weight. But in its context, remember Exodus 24:10 starts out, if a man wants to take another wife, in other words, he's already married, and he decides he wants to take another wife, then he cannot reduce these 3 things. All right? If we think about it, in that one verse, the Torah makes impossible a second wife. You can see that the Torah, as is given through Moses, frequently rectifies problems that occurred within people, such as Jacob taking 2 wives. It'll frequently prohibit behavior that has occurred before and said, this was a mistake, this was a problem, Adonai can use it, but it's not his perfect will. Just like Yeshua said, in the beginning it was not so. They're asking him divorce questions. In the beginning it was not so. There was one husband, one wife. That's the way it was at the beginning. And so in this text, it says that he cannot, if he takes a second wife, he cannot reduce the food, and that's why we looked at the spiritual, deeper meaning of the word, revealing the inner flesh, the coverings, to cover yourself, to be so close that when you cover her, you cover yourself. And number 3, the onah, the time of intimacy, the time that you spend with her. The second you introduce a second person, you automatically reduce those things to the first. Therefore, the text itself creates an impossibility. In the beginning, it was not so. And so you can see that seed right there is encouraging the mutuality of these two people, encouraging the unity of these two people. So, whereas in other contexts, Paul seems to be speaking into issues of authority, in this particular context, he says, your submission should be mutual. Because he's really clear. He's not equivocating at all. He says the wife does not have authority over her own body, but the husband does. And likewise, also the husband does not have authority over his own body, but the wife does. And so he's taking that seed of Exodus 24:10, which appears to apply only to the male, his obligation to the female. Paul is taking this and expanding it. He's not adding to the Torah. He's taking the actual seed and he's growing from the seed thought of the Torah. Just like in the Torah, it gives instructions on how to select a judge. And it seems like a very male-oriented task to select a judge. The assumption here is it applies only to males. Nevertheless, we find Deborah fulfilling the male role. There are other contexts, just like the fulfillment of vows. It seems very clear that it's husbands or fathers who can nullify a woman's vow. But in the book of Esther, it's really clear that Mordecai is not just imposing this on Esther to nullify the king's vow. He's actually assigning to her the punishment, the curse that would go with it if she did not, as if she were a man, as if she were functioning according to the annulment of vows in the place of the husband. Why? Because there is a mutuality in a marriage, and Paul is teaching us this here. Neither has full unilateral authority. The authority belongs to the other because it's a team. Remember the yoke? If we only go according to the strength of the ox, then we're skewed. If we only go according to the intelligence of the donkey, we're skewed. And so to prevent that, where it seems like we expend a lot of energy and get nowhere, Paul here is talking about that equal yoke, pulling in the same direction. And so in this context, he's actually using, because like I said, he's from the school of Hillel. He knows the oral law. And so he's telling believers here that there is a mutuality of obligation. And he's actually basing it on that foundational text of Exodus 24:10, which again It forms the basis of Jewish marriage law. And so, there again, in terms of a marriage, Satan works in unilateral decisions. If we're speaking to the Spirit-filled single, remember in the first couple of programs here, we talked about having that mentor or that counselor. That's the danger of your making unilateral decisions without good counsel. You need someone who can speak authoritatively but respectfully into your life to help you counterbalance in that yoke. We'll continue the commentary in the next program.